Hello, and welcome to Storytelling Animals, a green new podcast of climate, ecology, and animal justice. I'm your host, Dayton Martindale, and today my guest is Oliver Milman. He's an environment reporter for The Guardian, and his new book, just out this month, is called The Insect Crisis: The Fall of the Tiny Empires That Run the World. We talk about all the many reasons that we should all be very concerned about the insects of this world, why we need them, how we can protect them and help them recover their populations, and also follow up on some of the topics from my last episode with the ethicist Jeff Sebo, where we think about, okay, what do we actually owe insects for their own sake, not just because they're useful to humans. I also want to add that Oliver briefly mentions the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, a very influential book in the environmental movement of the 1960s. This will actually be the next Storytelling Animals book club book at the end of April, the last Tuesday in April, April 26th. If you are interested in joining that, the monthly book club is for Patreon subscribers of $7 a month or more. But if that is financially not doable, or if you want to try it out before committing, just reach out to me. And I think anyone who signs up for my newsletter in the next month is welcome to attend that Silent Spring discussion as a trial run. All right, here we go. Hi, I'm here with Oliver Milman, author of The Insect Crisis: The Fall of the Tiny Empires That Run the World. Oliver, thanks for coming on the show.
Good to be with you. Hi.
Great. Yeah, so before we get into the details about the insect crisis, I'm curious about the backstory of this book. How'd you end up writing about the decline of insect populations?
Yeah, I think I would be surprised as anyone to discover, a few years back that I'd be writing my first book on this topic. It wasn't something that I was always hugely animated by. I mean, certainly as a kid, I used to kind of poke underneath kind of rocks and logs and look for earwigs and ants and so on. I've always been interested in the natural world and wildlife, but as an environment writer for The Guardian, I've always been drawn to the big kind of charismatic beasts of our time, much like many journalists, who cover this area. You think about kind of polar bears and orangutans and rhinos and lions and that kind of thing. So the idea that I'd be writing about insects from a kind of conservation environmental point of view would seem a little strange to me. But then around kind of 2017, 2018, we started to get a kind of torrent of these studies coming out showing huge kind of insect declines in various places around the world. And we started to become introduced to these terms like insect Armageddon, insectageddon, insect catastrophe, and so on. And there seemed to be this kind of rising awareness that something was seriously amiss in the world of insects. And it became clear to me the more I kind of poked around the topic, dug into it, and spoke to researchers involved, that this was perhaps the conservation story of our time. It was this kind of silent kind of crisis happening in the background of our world, but was perhaps more important than any other kind of loss that was happening in terms of the natural world. So I thought it was a good idea to kind of look into it, to kind of capture that and explain that to readers.
Mm-hmm. So why is it so important? You call it in the title "The Tiny Empires That Run the World." How do insects run the world?
Yeah, I mean, they do a lot of the kind of really unheralded, unglamorous, not very flashy jobs that actually keep things ticking over on Earth, and we kind of take them for granted, really. I mean, they've been around for so long doing these jobs that we kind of think that we're kind of the pilots of this show, and we're not really. We're kind of in the back sipping martinis. The pilots are actually insects and other creatures like that. They're the ones driving this thing. So, I mean, of course, we kind of know that primarily insects are very useful for us in terms of pollination. We think of bees primarily for that, but flies do that too, and butterflies and moths as well. About a third of the world's food crops depend on insects for pollination. So without them, we wouldn't have apples, cranberries, melons, cherries, blueberries, lots of other things. We wouldn't even have chocolate because this tiny midge is responsible for pollinating the cacao plant that chocolate comes from. We wouldn't have ice cream because alfalfa, which is used to feed cows, is pollinated by insects. So all of the kind of colourful, interesting, nutritious things on our plate, as well as the kind of delicious treats that we have to treat ourselves with from time to time, they all come from insects. So it's extremely important that that food supply is secure, especially given the growing population of the world. We're already in the kind of pollination deficit, so that's that is a concern for those who look at this area.
What is a pollination deficit?
So a pollination deficit is a lack of pollinators to produce the volume of food that you require. So if you have a certain amount of land and you're looking at a certain yield from that land, fruits or vegetables or other crops, a lack of pollinators means that you cannot properly propagate those plants and get that yield. And we're already seeing the kind of first signs of that, the first kind of reductions in yields of certain fruits and vegetables because of lack of pollinators. And in places in such as China, there's areas there where people are actually sent out into fields and fan out with into fields with holding sticks with feathers and brushes on them so that they can hand pollinate the plants themselves. So that's their kind of extreme version of what happens when you have a pollination deficit. You have to somehow try and replace bees, and that's not very easy because they're very good at what they do.
And then in addition to pollination, there's some interesting stuff about decomposing feces and dead life forms.
Yes, that's right. So as much as we don't really like to think about it, our dead bodies have to go somewhere, or the animals' dead bodies have to go somewhere. All of the poo in the world that's created has to be broken down, and that wonderful job is mainly done by beetles and blowflies and other insects. One researcher said to me that if it wasn't for insects, we'd be living in a world of poop with dead Uncle Jeremy floating on past us, because we would just be surrounded in this kind of revolting sea of kind of crap and dead bodies. So that's a really important task they do. It's important kind of aesthetically and from a health perspective, from our point of view, but it's also important from the functioning of ecosystems, because insects do an invaluable job in cycling nutrients through soils and plants and trees, and the decomposition process is a big part of that. They kind of keep ecosystems ticking over. They keep forests and grasslands healthy and vibrant, full of life. And so they do all this kind of background work that we do tend to kind of take for granted, really.
And of course, they are food for birds as well. Some of the sort of most heartstring pulling parts of the book are hearing about all these birds starving due to insect declines. At least for me. So let's talk about that then, because you write in the book that there's a relative lack of data on insect numbers compared to, say, all the research that's done on mammals and birds, but that based on the data that we have and the research that's been done, there's a lot of reason to be concerned about insect populations. Could you walk us through some of the key points of this evidence?
Yeah, sure. So like you say, we don't have data on insects in every single country in the world. That's partly due to the fact we don't know all the insects out there in the world. There's a million named species of insects in the world, but the estimates go from kind of 5 million, 10 million, maybe 30 million species of insects out there. We just haven't catalogued all the life out there. and we certainly haven't catalogued all the declines out there, but there are some studies showing some quite extraordinary declines in insect numbers in certain parts of the world. And scientists now are pretty confident in saying there are these kind of widespread losses going on, and they have kind of profound consequences for us all. So, I mean, one of the big studies to kind of kick this off, this kind of era of concern over insects, kind of happened in 2017. There was a study coming out of Germany, and it looked at the insects caught in traps in nature reserves, 63 nature reserves across Germany. And the scientists who actually crunched this data, and it was taken from this entomological society that had it all on kind of floppy disks and typewritten notes and CD-ROMs, and stretching back a while. They found, once they actually crunched those numbers, they kind of found that since 1989, the annual average weight of flying insects there had dropped by 76%, which is incredible. In the height of summer, when insects are at their peak, it was down 82%. You go look at somewhere completely different, the rainforest of Puerto Rico, El Yunque, which is the only rainforest on US territory. There's this entomologist who went out there in the 1970s to conduct some surveys of insect life there. He decided to go back a couple of years ago, and he conducted the same sort of trapping research he did in the 70s, and he found 98% of insects by biomass had gone compared to the 1970s on the forest floor, and up in the canopy it was about an 80% decline. So these are kind of extraordinary declines. I mean, beetle abundance is down 83% in this forest in New Hampshire that was studied. Butterflies are down 84% in the Netherlands since the 19th century. About half of butterflies in Britain have disappeared in the last 50 years. I mean, wow. Wherever you look and wherever the actual studies have been done, you're seeing these declines, and there are some that are doing okay, and some that are actually increasing due to the changes that we are enacting upon the world. But overall, the story is pretty grim. There have been a couple of studies looking at the kind of the totality of this. There was one meta-study in 2018 finding that 40% of insect species are declining globally, and that insect populations are falling by about 1 to 2% a year around the world. Again, this is a kind of incomplete picture because we don't know everything that's going on, but that's scientists' kind of best guess of what's happening on a kind of broad global basis.
There's one scientist you quote who says something to the effect of, we aren't necessarily going to see the complete collapse of insects, like humans will go extinct before insects do if it gets that dire. But what is the worst case scenario, or even realistic case scenario, if we don't change anything of what we're facing with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important point to think about, is that we will not outlast insects because they're so important to us and they're so legion that we will probably go first. The natural world really doesn't care if the world is populated by lions and polar bears and dolphins rather than cockroaches and rats and raccoons. I mean, if we're making a world conducive to cockroaches, rats and raccoons, that's what will proliferate. They will take advantage of the conditions that we've set up, and that's essentially what we're doing. We're changing the composition of the insect world around us. So, through climate change, for example, mosquito range is expanding, especially disease-carrying mosquitoes. So an extra billion people in the world are expected to be exposed to disease-carrying mosquitoes due to the heating up of the planet. Cockroaches, there's 2 species of cockroach out of the many thousands that there are that are very well adapted to human life, the American cockroach and the German cockroach. So they will do quite well in a world where there's more people, more waste, more places for them to kind of scuttle around and hide in our homes. That's kind of a good change for them. But many of the things that we value, many of the things that we think are important or beautiful or worthy of continued life in the world, they're the things being threatened. The bees, and butterflies, and other kind of interesting creatures. The fireflies, the things that really come to delight us, as well as have a kind of obvious functional use for us. So the loss of them is quite a profound one in terms of food security. So the United Nations has already warned that food security is an issue due to pollination declines. There's one study showing that there's going to be more than 1 million extra deaths around the world a year due to conditions leading from the malnutrition due to lack of pollination, heart disease and other conditions like that. And we're already seeing the kind of reduction happening, so that's already in train. You also start to see bird declines and other creatures that rely upon insects for food. So we're already seeing that. There's studies showing big drops in bird numbers in France, in Germany, in Canada. Even in the heart of the Amazon rainforest, you're seeing the insect-eating birds falling away, such as kind of warblers, swallows, the bluebirds. Generally speaking, those are the insect-eating birds that are not doing well. Well, the omnivorous birds, such as crows and starlings, they're pretty holding steady. So there is kind of this kind of fingerprint of evidence of insect declines wherever you look, really. So we risk losing larger creatures. We risk losing a lot of our food supply. We risk having generally speaking, less vibrant, less healthy, less sustainable landscapes around us in terms of forests and other types of ecosystems. So the impacts are kind of broad when you think about what will happen if we keep losing insects at this rate.
You mentioned that mosquitoes and cockroaches, or at least particular species thereof, might actually do okay with certain human impacts. But one of the things I appreciate in the book is that you hasten to add not all mosquitoes and not all cockroaches. Could you maybe share a couple of the surprising or fun facts you learned about insect species that might not be as beloved as a butterfly or a honeybee?
Sure. So, I mean, cockroaches are really interesting creatures in that we despise them and we don't want them anywhere near us. And yet there is no evidence to show they spread disease in humans at all. If you're asthmatic, they may let off pheromones which are not helpful, but they aren't the kind of dreadful monsters we consider them to be. They're in fact incredibly impressive. I mean, these are creatures that can survive for 2 weeks after being beheaded. They can bite with a force 50 times their own body weight. They can fit in tiny cracks. And they come in all shapes and sizes. I mean, most of them kind of live in forests doing important work in terms of the ecology of the forest. There's the largest one is the giant burrowing cockroach, which looks a bit like a walking helmet because it's got armour on it. And some people even keep it as a pet in Australia. So they have a kind of remarkable diversity to them. And they do a lot of important work other than just terrify us at home. Mosquitoes are the same, really, to an extent. I mean, as much as they have a negative impact due to diseases they carry, they actually do work that we don't really appreciate. I mean, they are food for amphibians and birds that would suffer if they weren't around. And they pollinate plants as well, tansies and some other plants that they're a pollinator for. So even the most reviled insects have their role. Nothing is kind of completely out of place on this planet, even if we would wish it to die off.
Mm-hmm. There's kind of I don't know if tension is too strong a word, but I'll call it a tension in your book between you have sections where you're really trying to convince us that humans should care about insects because this decline is going to have dramatic and drastic impacts upon humans. And I think that's true, and that should be sufficient for us to care. But you also, in other parts, you want to convince us that actually insects are pretty cool, and that maybe we shouldn't only see them as tools for us. Um, so how do you think about kind of these two distinct but related reasons for caring about insects?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think there's always a danger we kind of go down this kind of human-centric viewpoint, where we see things only in relation to us, or benefit or otherwise to us. And I think that has been one of the reasons why we find ourselves in the mess we do now. We kind of have blundered around the world, changing things, killing things off, without much thought to the kind of long-term consequences, but more about the short-term gains to ourselves. So I think I did want to kind of keep coming back to the intrinsic value of insects, that they're not just here to service us. They're not just here for our amusement or displeasure. They have been around for 400 million years, much longer than us. They've outlasted the dinosaurs. They're worthy of our respect. They're not just tools of us. So I did want to keep coming back to that, but I was also very aware that there are not many people, although there are lots of insects fans out there, surprising number actually I've found through this book, there are not many people out there who are going to radically change their lives just for insects' benefit. There's not lots of people who are going to even do small things probably for insects' benefit. The best way to think about how we can change things for them is also the co-benefits that we will have. I mean, ultimately, that is the way that this problem will probably get solved, is because we'll change some things with ourselves in mind. I mean, ultimately, it is a book about insect conservation, but it could be a book about human conservation, because without them would be nothing. So we need to save them, but we need to save ourselves too.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, on the previous episode, I spoke with the ethicist and philosopher Jeff Sebo, who just wrote a book called Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves. And toward the end of the book and toward the end of that interview, Jeff and I started talking about insects, and kind of his take is that we know enough about insect cognition and neurological structures that we can at least think there's an okay chance that they are sentient and think and feel. And if there's even an okay chance, then we should start worrying about them for their own sakes as well. There are three main causes that come up throughout your book that threaten insects, both, again, their intrinsic well-being and flourishing, and also their roles in human societies and helping us. Pesticides, climate change, and habitat destruction. I'm not going to ask you to sort of rehash the whole book. I want people to read it, but if we could maybe just go through one by one the general shape of the threat, starting with pesticides.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we've doused a very large part of our world with these chemicals. There's a few different types, obviously herbicides and fungicides are two classes, but the main one, obviously, for insects' point of view, is insecticides. And what you're seeing now across the US landscape is a drastically more poisonous environment than it once was. I mean, by one estimate, US agriculture has become 48 times more toxic to insect life than it was 25 years ago. So there's been this layering of pesticides in the environment that just has built up and up and up and up to the point where it's just extremely deadly for insects, and not just the pests that they're aimed at, but all other kind of insect life that comes into contact with it, the bees, the butterflies, the beetles, and so on. Neonicotinoids are the class of chemicals that are most widely used and the most dangerous for insects. It's been calculated they're about 7,000 times more toxic to bees than DDT, which was that kind of infamous chemical from that was restricted in the US following the publication of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson in the 1960s. Was blamed for the decline of bald eagles in America. So we're actually spreading chemicals that are actually worse by orders of magnitude than DDT across the land. And the frustrating thing, I think, for many entomologists is there's good evidence this doesn't really help crop yields. It's not hugely beneficial for farmers. So they've been caught up in this kind of toxic cycle that's been terrible for wildlife. So that's pesticides for you.
Mm-hmm. And then you mentioned that climate change in some cases is going to be good for the mosquitoes that spread malaria because they like warmer temperatures. But what's an example of an insect that will be harmed by climate change?
I mean, a lot of them really. There was one study showing that half of all insects will lose more than half of their current habitable range if the temperature increase continues unrestrained by the end of the century. So, I mean, insects are usually constrained to a fairly narrow band of habitat and therefore climate and temperature. I mean, unless you're a monarch butterfly or a dragonfly, you can't move great distances if you're an insect. So you're kind of stuck where you are. There are bumblebees in the Arctic, for example. There are bumblebees even in the US that have been found to be suffering because of the warming temperatures. They just can't cope with it. They can't regulate their bodies. They can't move in any way to escape them. So they're suffering. So there's kind of major impacts from that, and a kind of broad kind of impact from the scrambling up of the seasons. So, in some places in the US, springtime is arriving about 20 days earlier than it did, at the start of the last century. So, that triggers all kinds of problems because obviously you have this kind of process happening in tandem between insects and plants. When plants start to blossom, you get the insects there, and then you get the birds there. It happens all in a kind of interlinked way. So once you start messing around with springtime and it arriving earlier, you have that whole relationship is out of kilter, it's out of sync. And that's what we're seeing happening, and it's detrimental to everything involved.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that changing climates will reduce the available habitat available to insects. What are some of the other ways that we're destroying insect habitat?
Well, I mean, we've chopped down a third of the world's trees since the age of industrialization, so that in itself has obviously had an impact. We've transformed insect-rich environments such as grasslands, kind of wildflower meadows, into monocultural farming fields, highways, urban sprawl, industrial areas, and so on. We've essentially created a kind of hellscape for a lot of insects because they can't really survive very well in that kind of environment. They like a kind of diversity of plants, a kind of untidiness that we don't like, and they like the kinds of things that we don't tend to plant very often in terms of the foods we want to grow for ourselves and that are profitable. So one researcher said it's like all there is to eat is chips. Even if you don't like chips or allergic to chips, that's all you're given is chips. And that's what it's like if you're a bee and you're looking over a field of soy or corn. I mean, there's just nothing else there for you. And I think that kind of gets to a kind of key kind of reason for this, which is this kind of fundamental difference to how we view the world versus how insects survive and how their well-being. I mean, it's polar opposites. We like a kind of tidy, ordered, systematic way of doing things with our land. We like everything in its right place. We call plants a weed if it's in the wrong place. I mean, that's the only reason you call it a weed, because we don't like it where it is. Whereas to insect, that's food and shelter. Insects like the kind of bohemian untidiness that we dislike. We like, manicured lawns and tidy borders, and we think that if there's kind of things growing in urban areas, for example, we think that it's a sign of, dereliction and decay rather than life springing back. So there is that kind of fundamental disconnect between us and insects as to what life should look like and how we should operate.
You mentioned the manicured American lawn. What if someone, obviously a lot of these solutions to this are going to be at a much larger scale than what a given individual can do on their own. But what do you have any tips for how to have a more insect-friendly yard?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like you say, a lot of this kind of has to happen at a kind of policy level around farming practices and pesticide use and climate change and so on. But I think the encouraging thing is that there are lots of things people can do individually that can make a difference. A million little changes by a million people can do a lot. And certainly you could start in your yard. If you do have a yard, maybe don't mow it every week. Let the grass grow a bit, because insects like that. They can't really do much with kind of, this kind of single swath of trimmed grass. There's not much of a home for them. You could maybe not rake the leaves in your yard, because insects like to gather under there. You could plant a kind of variety of native plants, let wildflowers grow a bit rather than kind of stick to, ornamental plants, exotic flowers from long distance away, so that native pollinators can have somewhere to feed. And you can certainly cut down the number of chemicals you use on your property. So there's a lot you can do. I mean, one of the most startling things I found out in the book is that lawns are the single largest irrigated crop in America. Like the 3 times amount of land is given over to lawns in America than corn. But you wouldn't think about it in that way. I mean, it's just a huge amount of space that's given over to this grass, shore grass that doesn't really have any life in it. So culturally, we perhaps need to rethink on that.
Mm-hmm. One of the other short sections of the book that really struck me as something that I don't think a lot about is light pollution and the effects on insects. Can you? Yeah, I know that moths are drawn to light, but I hadn't really thought much about the broader effects.
Yeah. There's all kinds of insects out there that have relied upon that kind of very reliable switch between day and night time for all kinds of things: mating, communication, finding food. And we've kind of messed that up really by kind of lighting up the night sky. And light pollution is obviously something we think about a bit when we look for the stars, I suppose, if you're in a city. But beyond that, we don't really think about it that much. But for insects, it's a matter of life and death. Especially, I mean, most visibly, things like fireflies that need a kind of dark sky in order to communicate with each other with their flashes. If they're unable to do that, then they cannot find mates, they cannot communicate with each other, and that's disastrous for them. There's this kind of constant glow around now. A lot of scientists will tell you it's never truly dark in a lot of places. Obviously, if you go out into kind of deep into rural areas, you can get that darkness, and that's fine. But around a lot of cities and the suburbs, it's very light. It's just this kind of low level light that's always around. It's never completely dark, and that's really harmful for a lot of insects.
Mm-hmm. I think one of we talked about this earlier, but the admirable thing the book tries to do is
shine some light on the flies and the beetles and the insects who maybe don't get a lot of positive press. But you do also have a couple chapters toward the end, one on honeybees and bees in general, and another on monarch butterflies that are insects that are maybe kind of more famous and more liked, but that also perhaps not greatly understood in the public. I was surprised by a lot of things in the honeybee section in particular. For instance, we know about bee colony declines. We've read headlines about that, but I was sadly surprised to see that, for instance, raising honeybees in your backyard can sometimes end up displacing native bees. I also had no idea about I forget what you called it, the pollination Super Bowl or something, where to get almonds, they truck all these honeybees across the country to California in a particular part of the season, and then they truck a bunch more somewhere else to pollinate another crop. So could you actually just talk a little bit about how that sort of those migratory pollinators?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a kind of complex picture, I guess. I mean, if you want to talk about the honeybees going to California, I mean, that's a huge logistical exercise that basically keeps food production afloat in America. I mean, it's not just they go to the Central Valley of California, they're then trucked up to the US Northwest for blueberries. You take them down to Florida for the citrus fruits. I mean, these are kind of traveling workers, really, that are kind of sent on the back of trucks and have become so valuable that there's this flourishing criminal enterprise out there to steal beehives because their pollination services are so have become so expensive now. It makes it worthwhile for thieves to steal beehives from beekeepers and sell them on. So there is this kind of massive industry in pollination now, and the role of a beekeeper has certainly changed from what you would imagine it to be. I mean, it used to be this kind of sideline hobby. You'd have someone in a beekeeping suit, maybe have a couple of hives out back, something you could just do for a bit of fun. You'd have some honey for your toast. But now you're a kind of contractor for huge farming corporations who have this kind of unquenchable thirst for pollination, and you're desperately trying to keep your bee numbers up to fulfill those contracts and keep the food supply steady. And it's becoming just a tougher task for them. I'm speaking to beekeepers who are just saying, geez, this is just so difficult because the disease that's going through the honeybee communities, the obviously climate change they're dealing with, pesticides they're dealing with, it's hard just to keep the bee numbers up. One of them said it was a bit like we're addicted to heroin here because you can't say no to the money on offer from the contracts, but you have to do these kind of questionable things, these kind of unsustainable things to kind of keep honeybee numbers up. So yeah, it was a real kind of eye-opener to kind of show exactly how dependent we are on these creatures and the lengths that people have to go to keep the show on the road.
Yeah, it's always wild how, even as someone who tries to read a lot and has written about different aspects of the food system or environmental issues, that there are always just more facts about how, I don't know, just kind of crazy it all is. Just, oh my gosh, people are trucking, I don't know how many bees across the country all the time. Is just not something that was on my bingo card of things that I thought growing almonds required.
No. Yeah, it surprised me too. When I kind of looked into it, I went out to California and I spoke to a bee broker, who's someone who matches up beekeepers with farmers, a kind of matchmaking service almost. I didn't even know that bee broker was a job. I didn't think that was something that somebody could do as a job. And yet the woman I spoke to, she only works for 2 months a year. She makes enough income from matching up beehives with farmers who need them that she can work for just 2 months a year and spend the rest of the time playing golf. So, yeah, it was an eye-opening trip for me for sure. Also got stung in the lip by a bee, so it was an eventful trip.
I don't forget journalism. Yeah, so speaking of bees, one of the things that stuck out to me, you talk with the scientist who was involved in a study where they cut off kind of beheaded bees to check the effects of certain pesticides on their brains, and the scientist says something like, it's not what you want to do, but it's worth it for science. And it did kind of strike me that a lot of the studies that we're talking about how they figure out how many insects are in a certain place and how the populations have changed is basically they set up traps that capture and kill the insects, and they just count, this trap in this area caught 100 insects 10 years ago, and now it only catches 30, or, obviously those numbers are made up. But I'm wondering if that was something on your mind at all as you were writing or researching, is just sort of that researching them involved killing them.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, to study insects in any way usually involves killing them, unfortunately, or sending them demented by giving them small amounts of insecticide to see what it does to them. I mean, that's been the case going back years, of course. We think about those kind of boards of pinned insects where people collect insects. You don't collect live insects, you skewer them and put them on a board to count insects. Traditionally, the way was to kind of fog trees with this kind of with these plumes of chemicals which would kill them, and they would just fall to the floor and you could collect them. A lot of the traps used involve kind of alcohol traps to kind of funnel insects into an alcohol trap and get them there. So yeah, in order to study insects involves killing a lot of them. I haven't seen a kind of alternative put forward otherwise, but yeah, it's certainly striking how many have to die in order for us to know what's going on with them.
Yeah, I think it would be cool if there were alternatives, but I have no idea. But I think what we can maybe do is at least try to make good on that research that's already done, and make it pay off for the insects. So yeah, you talked about that sort of larger scale farming policies and climate policies need to change. Toward the end of the book, you lay out what you call an inaction plan. What are, beyond the scale of lawns and porch lights, what are some of the larger scale things we can do to help insects?
Well, I mean, the European Union, for example, has banned the 3 main types of neonicotinoids, which are these deadly class of chemicals that affect insects so badly. France has gone even further and banned them for greenhouse use as well as for outdoor use. The US could do that, I mean, rather than keep authorising the use of these chemicals that the EPA continues to do here. I mean, Germany has done some interesting work around reducing light pollution, also banning gas-powered leaf blowers so that insects' homes aren't as disturbed as they are otherwise. And of course there's action to be taken on climate change. I mean, that's a huge multifaceted problem with a lot of reasons for action, but certainly acting upon it would benefit insects. So there are quite a lot of things that people can do to help, quite a lot of big policy changes that are required. Another important thing conservationists are thinking about now is wildlife corridors linking up habitat. So a lot of the habitat has been lost, which is important, but also it's become isolated. So insects aren't able to move through and feed and mate and so on. So there's some work being done by some green groups on how to connect up these spots. So it's not just tiny pockets of habitat here and there, it's actually a kind of network. So yeah, there's lots of work that could be done, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, I talked with the food writer Mark Bittman a couple episodes ago, and he talked about how he has been on what are called agroecological farms, where you almost can't even tell that it's a farm because there's so many different types of plant and wildlife species that it doesn't look anything like, the rows and rows of soy or corn that we might imagine. And I think you mentioned in the book that maybe a milder but still super useful step in this direction would just be even surrounding farms with patches of wilder land.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of these changes are things that won't cost us, certainly won't cost farmers. I mean, they're not going to lose out financially if they just have a border of wildflowers rather than just cutting down everything at the edges of their fields. I mean, it will actually help them really, because they'll be ushering back in insects that can eat the pests that they don't like around. So there's lots of kind of changes that we can do that will come to little cost to us, and in fact benefit us in many ways by acting upon it. We just need the will to do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope this book does something good in generating the will and more people start to get concerned about insects, more people involved in, again, not only whatever small scale things they can do on their own, but joining organizations concerned with climate change and farm policy and pesticides and stuff like that. And yeah, is there anything you wanted to add on all this, or any final words?
No, just maybe hopefully people listening can think about what's around them a bit more, and appreciate these tiny wonderful creatures. Think about them a bit as we go about our lives. But other than that, I think we've covered some really good ground.
All right, thank you so much, Oliver. And yes, everyone, please, after you finish listening, go outside and look around and notice 10 insects. It's your homework. All right, thanks everyone.
That was Oliver Milman, author of The Insect Crisis, The Fall of the Tiny Empires That Run the World. I actually, a couple hours after recording this interview, went out and did the sort of silly little homework assignment I gave. And the first 6 insects I found were ants, and I thought, okay, I don't just want to find 10 ants. So then I was looking around some more and saw some brown flying bugs that I didn't know what they were called. And it occurred to me, A, I wonder if I would have found more insects more quickly 10, 20, 30 years ago. And B, that I wish I knew that the type of ant that lived where I grew up, the names of all these insects. And so yeah, I'm not going to commit to looking into that, but I'm going to commit publicly that I would like to know and think we should be taught in school the natural history of where we grow up as well. One other quick thought before we go. I've been thinking about that exchange Oliver and I had about how a lot of the research that has shown the decline of insects involves killing insects. And, I kind of said that I guess we don't know what an alternative is. The alternative would be not doing the research. And in a lot of cases, that's the alternative I would favor. In this case, I wonder if we would even know that we should be raising the alarm about insects if this research hadn't been done. That's not to say it's worth it or it isn't worth it, but that it's kind of one of these thorny questions where what I would consider to be the rights of the individual animals might come into conflict with the well-being of other animals of their species or other species. These are some of the issues we discussed with Emma Maris in the very first episode, Jeff Sebo in the last episode, and they're not going to go away. Yeah, I don't necessarily have anything more insightful than that to add, but I guess I'm curious if any listeners can point me to any interesting thoughts about insect research ethics, any papers or articles they've read, or just their own thoughts. Please send them my way on Twitter, or you can find my email also on Twitter. Cool. I should say I'm reminded of a quote from Henry David Thoreau as well, who wrote, "The inhumanity of science concerns me, as when I am tempted to kill a rare snake that I may ascertain its species. I feel that this is not the means of acquiring true knowledge." Um, and I feel like I would like to believe that killing insects is not the way to acquire true knowledge, but yeah, just curious for thoughts on this. Also, that word is ascertain, not ascertain. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it to your social media, sending it to a friend, signing up for my weekly email list where you'll get the latest email straight to your inbox, and supporting us on Patreon. As mentioned at the beginning, our April book club, April 26th at 5:30 Pacific, 8:30 Eastern, is going to be discussing Silent Spring. So we'll be talking a lot more about pesticides. So if you enjoyed this conversation, you might enjoy that one. Have a good day.